All right, everyone, moving right along to the third talk of the day, I'm pleased to introduce Emily Riederer, who is a senior analytics manager at Capital One, who leads a team focused on reimagining their analytical infrastructure by building data products and elevating business analysis with novel data sources and statistical methods. Emily holds a dual bachelor's degree in mathematics and mathematical decision sciences, specializing in statistics and operations research from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Emily achieved an impressive 4.0 GPA, was awarded the most excellent graduate senior in statistics and operations research, and received the highest honors for her senior thesis on mathematical decision sciences. In addition to her impressive academic achievements, Emily is a contributing author to the R Markdown Cookbook, 97 Things Every Data Engineer Should Know, and she's also a seasoned speaker on designing data products, reproducible analysis, and data management, and has spoken at multiple conferences including RStudioConf 2018, 2020, and 2021, Strata NYC 2018, and Toronto Data Workshop. I think Emily maybe has the opportunity to have the most impact on our Shiny community here. For anybody new who's joining, she's going to be talking about why modules matter for new Shiny developers. I don't want to take any thunder from Emily, so Emily, I'll go ahead and pass it off to you.
Thank you so much, Ian, and delighted to be here today to talk more about why modules matter for new Shiny developers. So let me go ahead and share my screen here to get started. Oh, that's on. Share my slides.
We can see the slides, Emily.
Oh, can you? Perfect.
Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So today I'm here to talk about taking flight with Shiny and taking a modules first approach, both to learning Shiny and teaching Shiny. And this topic is something that's near and dear to my heart because it's really informed both by my personal learning journey of learning Shiny myself, as well as my work leading a team at Capital One, where I've onboarded over 10 new Shiny developers from 0 to 1 and helped them really get up to speed quickly to take charge and become in control with in-flight Shiny applications and a suite of mature data products. So before we talk too much just about Shiny, I want you to think about what you think it's probably like to learn to fly a plane. You can imagine you probably want to learn end-to-end skills and then scale them up over time. You'd want to successfully complete flights in flight simulators before flying a small plane, before maybe one day getting that aspirational goal of becoming an international commercial pilot. What you wouldn't want to do is dive into the deep end too quickly and learn skills a little bit too piecemeal. You wouldn't start trying to fly the largest plane available, or you wouldn't learn how to take off and then go decide to try that in a Boeing before actually learning how landing gears work. And I think this is all pretty intuitive, pretty obvious. And yet, when it comes to teaching and learning Shiny, I don't feel like that's the approach we take. I think we tend to throw developers deep into the deep end where things can get confused and gnarly very quickly. Even looking at some of the introductory examples in Pod's Shiny gallery, we can start to see how Shiny is a monolith that becomes quickly hard to read and debug. So for example, the k-means clustering application that uses the same DIRIS data set is a pretty simple application. It allows users to pick just a couple of user inputs for what variables they want to plot on the X and Y axes, the number of clusters, and to change interactively what's shown on that plot. But even to accomplish this small task, we can see how the monolithic approach to Shiny starts to get really complicated really quickly for new developers. If we inspect our server function here, we can see there's a lot going on. We're both wrangling inputs, trying for the first time to understand what reactives are and what we do with them. We're doing statistical computing that may or may not throw different sorts of errors if our data has null or missing values. And we're trying to visualize that output, pass it back to the front end, again, layering on old and new concepts all at once. And in the sort of unstructured server function, there's so much indentation. And oh my goodness, when I first started learning Shiny, I was just overwhelmed by so many nested brackets. So I feel like this kind of amount of business logic going on in the server function can often be challenging for new developers because it really creates a lack of separation of concerns. And it's really anathema to how the R community, I think, has evolved to what we consider best practice pedagogy for teaching R as a whole. Over the past few years, I think the R community in general has done a great job thinking more about end-to-end workflows and introducing those to beginners. So with R, thinking about first writing a function, testing that interactively, maybe writing small unit tests, and eventually adding that to a script, a package, or in our markdown document. And yet with Shiny, it seems like when we start out teaching, we're often asking people to modify multiple objects or multiple code files at the same time for both the user interface and the server, launching the full application, potentially getting some cryptic error messages in our console, and not being sure how to test and iterate and put in breakpoints to figure out what's even going wrong. And I think I always have felt that that makes things a little bit harder than necessary. But just like we've increasingly moved to a functional approach to teaching basic R programming, modules can offer a lot of that same separation of concerns as R functions. In fact, I like to think of modules as simply being R functions that are more able to exist in a Shiny environment with more knowledge of kind of the reactive nature of Shiny applications and the UI server paradigm. We already heard a great overview of modules earlier this morning, but just in case anyone missed that talk, I'll give a quick recap. Writing a module looks a lot like writing a basic mini Shiny application. We define a user interface, we define a server, and essentially we're just defining a factory function that can create additional servers as needed for every time we instantiate a module. But again, we can write our normal UI code, normal server code, just as you may know if you've written the more monolithic Shiny apps before. But my favorite part of modules is they let us carve out these smaller bits of functionality and test them independently. Anytime I write a module, I tend to write a module demo function as well. And what this demo function allows me to do is create mock-up fake small data of whatever my module is actually expecting, pass it in to an instantiated version of my user interface, of my server, and with this, be able to quickly deploy my module and test that one piece of functionality in isolation. So I only have to worry about one thing at a time. So again, just to recap, modules are like the functions of the Shiny programming paradigm, and they give us all these benefits like isolated functionality, independent testability, and ultimately composability. So you can only worry about one thing at a time, but a newer developer can then essentially be making their own set of Legos, their own set of building blocks that they can ultimately piece together to layer on the complexity to make a full application. So to see how this works, I want to talk through for the rest of our time today an example of a modules first paradigm. But before I do that, I do just want to emphasize how different this is from how the messaging we typically give Shiny developers of when they should start learning modules. Hadley Wickham's amazing book, Mastering Shiny, gives a great overview with more details on how to learn and use and deploy modules. However, this doesn't come up until chapter 19 in the best practices section. And even that framing around this being a best practice, I think can either message two really counterproductive things to new learners. Either modules aren't something you have to worry about now, or modules are beyond your abilities and something that you can't do now. And by walking through this next case study, I want to argue that neither of those things is true. So going back to our motivating flight example, imagine we work in an airline on a team responsible for tracking on-time performance of flights. Of course, if you had to fly anywhere this summer, you might question whether such teams actually exist at airlines, but that's beside the point. Some of the functionality we might want this application to have is being able to track multiple metrics and examine those metrics across time and evaluate the success of our airline's on-time performance based on some pre-established goal, and potentially integrate with other analysis and reporting frameworks, and lay the groundwork possibly for bringing in fancier R code like forecast and simulation over time. So overall, seems like a great application for a Shiny dashboard. And the dashboard that we're going to talk about a new user building today with a more modular approach will ultimately look something like this. It's not admittedly going to win any beauty contests, but it really nails all of the functionality we need. A user can pick a month of interest for which to generate the report. And for that report, they can then see plots of multiple metrics, such as the average departure delay, the average arrival delay, get a nice text summary of how that metric is performing, see the plot, and download the underlying plot if they wanted to move that into a different presentation they're making, send it in an email, etc. So even this, again, not the most complicated app in the world, but there's still a fair amount going on and a fair number of requirements that a new developer might have to navigate through. So the first step of a modular approach, I think, is really focusing on decomposing those requirements and figuring out what can exist in its own module. So we know at the highest level, the user needs to pick the month of interest to visualize. After that, we can assume the data only contains that month. We're only focusing on the problem of what do we do with the relevant piece of data. And then for each metric of interest, we know we want to plot the time series plots, provide a download button, and provide that text summary to have all of the information we want at a glance. And similarly to how with functions we talk about the dry programming convention of don't repeat yourself, that for each, I think, is a good kind of like spark in your imagination that it's maybe time to start thinking about modules. So let's see then how this new Shiny developer could actually use modules to build this application. The first module we could start out with is something as simple as just generating that text summary of how many times our metric of interest breached the criteria that we've established. So the UI function here becomes very trivial. We just have a simple container and one single text output of the summary text. On the server side, apart from the boilerplate code of returning the module server, we're able to also keep things pretty simple and pretty unnested, not too many brackets, not too much indentation. All we need to do is use the data frame that we're already assuming has already been filtered to be the right data frame we want to look at. We can calculate the number of times that our event of interest happened, and we can simply create a text string, which is getting passed back to the user interface. It's all very clear, very evident what's happening. And again, with my favorite part of modules, which is their independent testability, we can very easily wire up an example to see whether or not that baby Shiny app works. We mock up a data set with just a few rows of data that then can be passed in to the instantiated user interface and server components, launch the app, and complexity a little bit. And the next module that a new developer might want to build is everything to do with the plotting functionality. So here our UI has gotten a tiny bit more complicated, and that we have two components, not one, organized side by side. We want to return both a plot element and that download button, so users can take the plot out of the app, carry it with them. But on the server side, again, we all still have a very reasonable amount of targeted logic, all with the aim of solving for a single goal. We're creating a plot based on our reactive dataset, we're returning the plot to the environment, and we're returning the ability to react when the download button is clicked. And once again, I think I can stop harping on the benefits of having the demo functions now, but when we launch that new developer can really see that now they've actually built an application that does something, that has kind of an interesting plot. They can click that download button, test it out immediately, apart from the overall application. So those are kind of like shows how you can get your feet wet and start really small with really narrow functionality enabled by modules. But even more exciting, I think, is when you start using your own modules to layer up that complexity in a very streamlined way. We said before, for every single metric in our application, we wanted to have both the text component and the plot component. So we can define an overall metric level module that encapsulates both of those components. But because all of the text logic is isolated in one place, all of the plot logic is isolated in another place, ironically, the more complex module is actually the simplest and easiest to read. It's very clear just eyeballing this metric, hopefully what it does, providing both the text element and the plot element. And we've extracted ourselves from the possible morass of looking for that one missing bracket somewhere in the application. And finally, I can't help but emphasizing one more time, we can run our self-defined metric demo function, test that thing out, see all of the pieces coming together. So at the point that the developers worked piece by piece on these very modular, focused mini applications, it actually becomes a very trivial task to piece all these together in the final application. Just like I showed you with the module that's composing multiple modules, when we look at the code for the full application, it's very semantic and it's able to very much focus just on a more declarative programming in a sense of almost the glue code. The UI is easily eyeballed to see, oh yes, we have a title, we're letting users pick 1 month to generate a report, and then we're generating a report that shows different information about 3 different metrics. And all the server at the top level has to do is efficiently filter the data set to the month of interest, so that only has to happen once instead of separately for every single plot, get some performance benefit there, and generate the important information for each of the metrics. So hopefully this is kind of exciting to new developers, because the things that they built along the way in a very focused and streamlined way has really quickly scaled up into something that's fully functional and meets everything that they intended to do. That being said, I definitely don't want to overpromise on what modules can deliver or how easy they are for beginners. Definitely, I think the easiest type of modules are ones that just resemble these really targeted mini Shiny applications, where we're receiving some sort of reactive component and generating a single output. Or in the case, if you think of our metric module that we just saw, potentially taking in both reactive inputs as well as some configurations, like the variable of interest was just another parameter that we're passing into that module, just like you pass a parameter into a function. It does, as we saw earlier this morning in Marcin's talk, get a little bit trickier when you want to use your module to actually interact with the broader environment and calculate reactives within the module that then will trigger other behaviors throughout the application. Again, we saw a couple of great design patterns for doing this earlier. If you missed Marcin's talk, highly recommend you check it out when it becomes available online after the conference. But definitely, I think a pattern that can be a little more intimidating to beginners, and possibly where I might try to draw that reasonable line. But the best part about beginners also is they're not going to be beginners forever. And I think modules also really help set the stage for easily advancing and growing your career and growing your experience into more complex workflows and even more mature paradigms more quickly. Just a few examples of this are some of the excellent frameworks we now have for building large-scale Shiny apps, like the Golem package, which strongly relies on modules and has some great helper functions for creating them. Similarly with Epsilon's Rhino package, and even better being able to better utilize kind of developer and productivity tools like the Supreme package that help us better understand our application by parsing out the nature of the modules that are being used to build them. So from that individual perspective, not only do modules, I think, help you hit the ground running a little bit faster, but they can also be a real accelerant to the growth throughout your career as a Shiny developer. But even more than the individual benefits, having led a team that focused on building and maintaining many large, long-lived Shiny applications, I've also seen many organizational benefits as well. I've talked a lot about the faster ramp up, and that being due to the separation of concerns of different parts of applications. But this becomes even more critical when I'm bringing a new member onto the team and trying to onboard a completely new Shiny developer from 0 to 1. They can become productive a lot more quickly because they can make changes, feature enhancements, debug that one small module before they understand all of the logic of the complete data flow, the complete applications. It really gives them a bite-sized piece that they can jump in and start owning. And of course, separation of concerns isn't just useful for the developer, but also incredibly useful for the rest of the team when they're doing code reviews. Because Shiny apps do such, and modules do such a good job isolating that functionality, it's easy to make sure there aren't unexpected spillover effects or larger blast radius than one might have anticipated when making a change to an application, because you can very easily test, really dig into all of the code in that module that a pull request from a new developer is bringing to the table. And this just more generally leads to better system resilience. So it's easier to test changes, roll back changes, understand kind of the entire impact for both that developer and the reviewer alike. And this alone, I think, also kind of makes it easier to bring new features to your Shiny app to market a lot faster, because you can deploy incrementally and with more confidence in those results. And finally, I personally am a big fan of using an inner source paradigm in the enterprise setting and developing a lot of internal R packages to help internal developer productivity. And I found that including modules in internal enterprise R packages can also be a great accelerant. This creates a sense of a design system where you can have multiple applications pulling from a common pool of modules, which not only, once again, really can speed up your developer workflow, but it also has the benefit of driving a lot of aesthetic and semantic consistency across all of your suite of applications. So kind of like whether you're that newest member on the team or the most seasoned, modules in the organizational setting have a lot of extra bang for their buck. So in conclusion, I'm a big fan of Shiny modules, and I encourage everyone at every level of their career to check them out. But if there was one takeaway from my talk today, it's that I think no Shiny developer is too early in their career to start learning. And with this paradigm, I really believe you can start cruising in no time. So thank you all very much for your time this morning. If you're interested in learning more, I believe the slides will be shared out, and I've linked a number of resources in them, including code for the application we walked through on GitHub, a related blog post I have, as well as a couple of great resources for learning about modules in general. Thank you very much.
Emily, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation and for joining us to kind of have the most important talk. I'm glad we're getting this out front because
Too fun.
last year's Shiny conference, it was just a repeated theme: modules, modules, modules. So I'll get to a few questions from the chat here in a second, but I was just having the thought that like modules are best practice, and sometimes when we are talking to people about modules and how important they are, sometimes this comes off as a little bit of like you need to eat your vegetables. And so I myself, I love making map-based applications, and I kept on doing this repeated thing where I had a leaflet map, plotly, data table, and they were all connected. I had so much fun building that, and like the real click for me was when I could apply that to another project, and all the work that I had put in could easily be translated. So, do you have any comments other than this is best practice? Everybody, please do this. Do you have any examples from your own life where like using modules really paid off for you?
Yeah, definitely. And I think in kind of similar to your example, I think like in kind of the team settings that were kind of I've like really leaned into modules, that reuse I think is another like super exciting benefit of just like kind of building this like kind of like package of content together that maybe you always want a widget to like select different metrics. You always want that plotly graph. You always want certain things in your tooltip. You maybe always want the ability to, I think anyone that's ever built a dashboard knows that people will always want to access the data underlying the dashboard, and just kind of like packaging up all of those different components, I think not only makes your development a lot more efficient and fun, but I think it also like gives you better perspective at the qualitative level of what problem you're trying to solve with each component of your Shiny application, and kind of building almost like the user story for every given module of really figuring out what you're trying to accomplish.
Thank you for that answer, Emily. So we had a comment in the chat from Maya Gans. Welcome, Maya. We're so happy to have you. And she said, I'm a super visual person, so I like to do an app design sketch using a flow diagram to think about module inputs and outputs and how they can all relate. So as a general question, Emily, have you ever tried this as a visual representation, or do you have some other method to help you think through a complex app you're trying to build?
Oh, I am the biggest pen and paper person ever, which I always like sometimes feel guilty to like cop to versus like in such a technical crowd. But I do think there's just something about kind of like sketching things out that I find is kind of really useful in, I mean, both the front end design, but also then thinking like, how does this functionality cluster? And even like using that to identify places for modules of like, if I've drawn the same like UI item multiple times on a page, maybe I just put a box around that and I'm like ×3. And then I remember like, oh yeah, that's probably something that a module can handle for me.
Okay, thank you for your answer there. So we had a question from Paul Campbell, and he says, "What's the opinion on making something like an entire Shiny page or tab, etc., a module composed of smaller modules within? It's unlikely a whole page of UI is going to be reused and replicated somewhere else in the app. So is it worth being a module?" So I think what he's kind of getting at is what we touched on with Martin's talk about like nested modules, and I hope that makes sense, and I wonder if you have any comment on that.
Yeah, definitely. I think from a like well-managed perspective, I still find a lot of benefits just in terms of having a lot of the components of your application be, I think, independently like testable, can be like really hard to beat. Um, and being able to kind of like have a sandbox around every single component, so you can kind of reason about what's happening in this component versus how does it affect the broader whole. Of course, sometimes that can make your like trace stack like go a little bit deeper when you have modules calling modules. So I definitely acknowledge the trade-off in complexity, but I think the independent testability to me like 9 times out of 10 pretty much always wins out.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for that answer. So we're coming up right on the end of our time, but there's been a little bit of little chatter back and forth in the chat log of VS Code versus RStudio. Do you have a preference? Do you have any opinion on that?
Oh my goodness, that is the toughest question of the day. I think big fan of both. Definitely grew up with RStudio, and I feel like its deep integration with R in general cannot be beat. I think I've recently been working a lot more kind of like polyglot workflows. Have definitely like come to appreciate the extensibility of VS Code as well, and just the countless array of kind of extensions. But can't go wrong with either, right? Good problem to have, two amazing options.
Excellent answer. Very diplomatic of you. So just to wrap this up really quickly, if people want to get in touch with you, if they have further questions, if they want to follow you and your work, what's the best way to do that? Are you on Twitter, LinkedIn?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm don't like uncommon enough last name that I'm pretty much at Emily Riederer on most any platform you can imagine. Still hanging on Twitter, recently on Mastodon as well, LinkedIn or email, all work as ways to get in touch. So definitely love talking to the R community about these things. So please, anyone that wants to feel free.
All right, fantastic. Well, Emily, thank you once again for joining us. We really appreciate having you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you, Ian. Loving it so far.